According to the agenda, the next item is a Council and Commission statements on climate change in developing countries in the framework of the UN Conference on Climate Change in Copenhagen. I would like to ask the Environment Minister that represents the Swedish government and the Swedish presidency of the Council to take the floor. Minister Andreas Carlgren is here. Good morning, sir.
Witamy serdecznie, prosimy.
Welcome, Minister. You have the floor, Minister, and we also have Commissioner De Gucht here. Welcome, Commissioner, but first I would like to give the floor to the Council representative. You have the floor, Minister.
Mr. Minister, you can take the floor. Just straight away.
And it's yes. Herr talman.
President, honourable members, we are at a decisive point in time. In less than 2 months' time in Copenhagen, the nations of the world will conclude an agreement to meet the climate challenge. It must be an agreement that will keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, will include all nations, and thirdly, will adapt future measures to new scientific knowledge. With 48 days to go to the opening of the major UN climate change conference in Copenhagen, political will needs to be translated into concrete action. But the negotiations are moving too slowly. Many important issues remain. Many are now falling for the easy way out, that is, sinking into pessimism. Let's make this clear. The EU has a different task. We want the EU to show leadership through a clear and unequivocal political will. For the Swedish presidency, a comprehensive and ambitious climate agreement is of the very highest priority. The EU's response to the negotiations is to push negotiations into a higher gear. We are prepared to take on the challenge of getting the other nations of the world to reach an agreement that is powerful enough to meet the climate challenge. To this end, we are working along 2 tracks. Firstly, by giving a powerful message to our negotiation partners. Secondly, by bringing the EU together behind a strong negotiating mandate for the Copenhagen conference. We already have a climate package in the EU, adopted by the Parliament and Council in December 2008. I would like to express special thanks to Parliament for the commitment of many here in the Parliament. That decision taken by the Parliament is a good one and has meant that we will have a stronger position in the upcoming negotiations. Now we need to put the final pieces of the puzzle in place to have a strong negotiating position, and we have to take a look at that at the European Council next week. I know there are many members here today who will be following the negotiations closely, and I also know that many of you will be present in Copenhagen. We need to reduce emissions to the level required to keep global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. This means that the bids on the table need to be raised. The EU is pushing to reduce emissions by 30% by 2020 if other parties do the same. We see the 30% level as something that can bring others up to that level, and 2050 emissions should be dropped by at least 80%. But to keep the temperature increase below 2 degrees, the EU's actions will not be enough. All nations have to take part. We have already seen some promising signs from the government in Japan, for example. Now we're urging other countries, not least the US, to raise their bids. Developing countries will be able to have sustainable development, which will also mean reduced emissions. We need to have low carbon growth plans and mainstream climate efforts with development strategies. This means that we can ensure that everybody will benefit from growth. We need to increase democratic governance, reduce poverty, increase equality. We place special demands on the fastest growing developing countries, not least China, which is the biggest emitting country in the world. They need to reduce their emissions by 2020 by at least 30%. Development issues must be at the core of what we do in Copenhagen. We say that fighting poverty needs to be given a high priority. We will take development issues within the negotiations. All countries, apart from the least developed, must pay for the measures that are taken, but we, the most developed countries, must show leadership by reducing our emissions ourselves. And we must also find proper measures. We need a sustainable international architecture to work together to give support to developing countries. This architecture needs to assist the poorest and most vulnerable countries, which are often hardest hit by climate change. Finally, I'd like to say the EU is prepared to take its share of the responsibility. The Council is aware of the scale of the financing required. In 2020, we need something like 100 billion euros a year for developing countries. The EU is prepared to provide prompt financing for rapid measures up to 2012 to increase trust between North and South in the negotiations. We are faced with a huge challenge in the remaining weeks before Copenhagen. That's why I'm turning to you. We need leadership from governments, but also from parliaments. And here the European Parliament has an important role, and we also need the support of our populations to reach our goals in Copenhagen. Thank you.
Pan komisarz De Gucht.
Thank you very much, Minister. I would like to give the floor to Commissioner De Gucht.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. President of the Council, Members of Parliament, dear colleagues. Let me first of all thank you for giving me the opportunity to express the Commission views on this sensitive issue. You are already aware that there will be no ambitious deal in Copenhagen if the concerns of the developing countries are not taken into account. Not only those of emerging countries, but also very much the concerns of the most vulnerable and the poorest developing countries. Nevertheless, reaching a good deal in Copenhagen is our common interest. Developing countries are the most vulnerable countries to climate change. The EU is the first donor in the world and the leader in the fight against climate change. We have to join our efforts. There is no place for North-South confrontation when you deal with climate change. I would even go further and say that no other alliance can be as determining and effective as the one engaging the most vulnerable countries and the ones who have put on the table of the negotiations the most ambitious proposals to fight this plague. That is to say, Europe. Our general approach towards the most vulnerable countries, followed up to now through the Global Climate Change Alliance, is made of 3 parallel strands which are interlinked and are mutually reinforcing. First, building political alliances through reinforced dialogue on climate change. 3 joint political declarations have been signed respectively with Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific, plus 1 with the ACP group as a whole. Second, promoting sound policies and strategies linking climate change and development. I am of the opinion that climate, resilient and low carbon policies must be integrated in wider development and poverty reduction strategies of our partners. There can only be a single development strategy which incorporates climate concerns, pursuing the objectives of sustainable development and poverty reduction. It is not a matter of choosing one or the other. Both are essential. In this spirit, we already support the implementation of the existing national adaptation programmes of action of the LDCs in 15 eligible countries. Third, encouraging adequate EU contribution to finance climate actions, in particular for adaptation, which is a priority concern for those countries that are most vulnerable to climate change impact, but that hardly contribute to greenhouse gases emissions. Mr. President, President of the Council, ladies and gentlemen, we are only 50 days away from Copenhagen. Expectations are very high, and we are worried because the negotiations are dangerously close to deadlock at the moment. It is now the time for putting offers on the table. That is what Europe has done, and that is what we expect our partners to do as well. We have made offers in terms of commitments. The EU has already put on the table ambitious targets and commitments, so far the second most ambitious on the table of negotiations. We have already guaranteed a unilateral 20% emission reduction by 2020, and we are committed to increase to 30% if comparable efforts are made by others according to their responsibilities and capabilities. Second, offers in terms of financing. We are all conscious that a deal on financing will be crucial to achieving an agreement in Copenhagen. To move forward in the negotiations, the EC issued mid-September its own proposals on finance. One of them is the need for short-term international public funding for climate to be scaled up for the period 2010-2012, to respond in priority to urgent needs identified in the most vulnerable developing countries and in particular LDCs, SIDS and African countries as defined in the Bali Action Plan. Another one is the readiness of the EU to take on its fair share of the estimated financing requirements, public funding contributions being based on preferred criteria of ability to pay and responsibility for emissions. These may lead to an EU contribution between 2 and 15 billion annually in 2020. These proposals will be discussed by the European Council of end October and will hopefully be the basis for a fully fledged EU negotiation position on finance. But action by the EU alone is not enough. We strongly hope that other developed countries will follow our path as the pressure grows before Copenhagen. We count on developing countries as well. They have to take the opportunity offered by climate financing to fully integrate adaptation into their development strategies and to move gradually to low carbon development paths for the longer terms. Although the focus has been up to now on adaptation for the poorest and most vulnerable developing countries, there is some ground to promote the design of low carbon development paths, that is mitigation, which are compatible with poverty reduction objectives in those countries. A specific focus on mechanisms to avoid deforestation and promote sustainable management of forests is crucial. Indeed, the fight against tropical deforestation is the largest immediate mitigation challenge for the LDCs, and they can be beneficiaries through mechanisms such as reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation schemes of its international financing. Similarly, ensuring in the future a more balanced distribution of the clean development mechanism investments in favour of the LDCs should also be part of the current reflection on the reform of this mechanism. Finally, a word on the delivery channels for climate funding. We, as a Commission, are not in favour of creating new funds. New funding for climate should use existing and potentially improved delivery channels, promoting a decentralised, bottom-up governance structure in support of country-owned action. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Dziękuję panu komisarzowi za wypowiedź. Teraz...
Thank you, Commissioner. We will now take the speakers from the political groups. Karl-Heinz FLORENZ on behalf of the EPP.
Besonders, dass ich Sie hier sehe als
President, I'm very happy to see you here as a former Environment Committee member in this debate. Council President in Office, Commissioner. It's right to say that the EU is sending a clear signal to Copenhagen. In the next 50 days, it's not at Copenhagen but in the corridors around Copenhagen that the mood music will play. The mood before these conferences is always the same, but that's the opportunity for the Commissioner. In the question of the US colleagues, I'd like to see you exerting some friendly pressure on them. We have to work with our counterparts there. I don't think there should be some kind of financial competition started up at the beginning with someone saying 15 billion, someone saying 30 billion, someone else wanting 150 billion as the figure put on the table. Let's come up with some criteria by which the money should be spent, and that will be a very robust contribution from Europe. But I think there needs to be some bottom to the barrel, if you like. The crisis has been well enough described. Let me just expand on some of the opportunities for the industrialised world in Europe and the USA. If we specify the standards, we'll be able to develop efficiently, and then, ladies and gentlemen, efficient machinery will be sold worldwide by Europe, such as to China, where energy needs to be produced more efficiently. It's not just the threat of climate change, but an opportunity to sell bang up-to-date machinery to stoke our economies. I think we need to seize this opportunity. We need to be much more courageous. We need to be entrepreneurial, politically entrepreneurial. We're going to have our heads up below water. If we can't do that, we'll have taken the wrong direction. So, Commissioner, I wish you a great deal of luck. Take a positive stance and try and bring the Americans along with you, and then we're halfway there.
Thank you very much. On behalf of the Socialists and Democrats, I would like to give the floor to Véronique De Keyser.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, President. Climate change leads to 300,000 deaths per year. It affects 325 million people, and more than 90% of people affected, and 90% of deaths are in the developing countries. Economic loss linked to climate change is more than 125 billion dollars per year, and most of it is shouldered by developing countries. So not only have these countries been hard hit by climate change, the economic crisis, and the unfair structures and mechanisms of international capitalism. So what are we asking for? It's true, and you mentioned this, and now I would like to turn to the Council presidency. You've asked for more ambitious Kyoto as a new agreement, and that is why the Copenhagen summit in December is so important. Increasing financial contributions in order to ensure that we meet this 0.7% of GNP target is extremely important. And then, of course, we have to make sure there's legal protection for these climate change refugees who are starting to come here. What are we going to do if they want to come to Europe? We really have to deal with this. Now, when it comes to Libya, Mr. De Gucht, please deal with the trade agreement and trade aspects in the new agreement with Libya. It's very important to factor in climate change. We have to deal with migratory flows in a decent manner and fill in the legal gaps that have an impact on the protection of these refugees. I think that we shoulder an enormous responsibility. Not only this is about solidarity, and we hold the future of the planet in our hands.
Thank you very much. For the ALDE group, Mrs. Corinne Lepage.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, we, as members of the European Parliament, have a twofold responsibility before us. To our people, who expect real efforts from us at Copenhagen, and to the southern countries. Europe has always been one of the champions, indeed the champion of them at international level. We need to give the countries of the south a real signal with a clear financial commitment which will add to development aid, which needs to be at 0.7% the agreed level. So this will be additional aid. The EU contribution should not be less than 35 billion euros per year by 2020, and by 2010 5 to 7 billion euro will need to be given to the developing countries to cover their most urgent need. We need to look at the funding mechanisms. We cannot confine ourselves merely to current funds. We need to look at other funding channels, because if there is no money in Copenhagen, there'll be no ambitious deal in Copenhagen. This will mean, most probably, even if it's very controversial, that we'll need to look at the question of a tax, a so-called Tobin tax or green tax, to fund the fight against climate change. Thirdly, when it comes to deforestation, I would recall that today this makes up 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore we absolutely must defend a zero gross deforestation rate by 2020. I would draw your attention to the difference between gross deforestation and net deforestation, which will mean that you could plant poplars to make up for the loss of ancient woods. It's not the same thing. So we need to be realistic about the needs of our industry, but also we need to be realistic about our own survival and that of our children.
Thank you very much. Now for the Green EFA group, Eva JOLY.
Monsieur le Président du Conseil.
President of the Council, Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, what is at stake in Copenhagen is the future of the planet. But before that, we have to deal with the credibility of the European Union that should spearhead this fight against climate change. There will have to be climate financing proposals from the member states at a critical time. The issue of mitigation, adaptation and climate finance in developing countries will go hand in hand, I hope, with ambitious targets in order to cut greenhouse gas emissions. The figures speak volumes. 100 countries, which are very poor, only account for 3% of global emissions. Developing countries have contributed the least to greenhouse gas emissions, but despite that, they're the ones that have been the most hard hit. 26 million people, according to Oxfam, have been forced to migrate because of the impact of climate change or because of other forms of environmental degradation. By 2050, we might be talking about more than 200 million climate refugees. Climate change will do away with the development of these developing countries and will mean that we won't be able to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. It's not about charity, it's about shouldering our responsibility and setting the basis for a peaceful and fair world. The current EU strategy is not commensurate with the goals that exist. We have to put our cards on the table now in order to breathe new life into the negotiations. The European Union cannot promise or pledge less than 30 billion euro in funding. Of course, this will go together with a public funding pledge for ODA, Official Development Assistance. And it's true that the member states don't always honor their promises. Council, the future of the planet is in our hands. If we do not put an end to the degradation of our environment and inequality, then the worst case scenarios could become true. We have to be ambitious. We don't want cowardly or shy EU. Please make sure you make the right choices. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, and also for sticking to the speaking time. That will set an example for others. For the ECR group, Miroslav OUZKY.
Thank you, Mr. President. President of the Council, Commissioner. To start with, I would like to respond to the previous speaker. I do not believe that it's the European Parliament or the European Union who are the least ambitious in this area. A year ago, we were finalizing the climate package, and I'm sure that's legislation which, in this respect, is the leader in the world. It's the most ambitious legislation in the world. And let's admit it, it's got the biggest economic impact among all of the initiatives that we have adopted during the last 10 years. When I read the declaration of the European Parliament for Copenhagen, well, there are things that I like. We say that we need to strengthen the role of the European Parliament. It says that we need to get ready and adjust to climate changes. We can't but agree with a clause which mentions deforestation. But I may just emphasize that deforestation is not and has not been just the problem of the developing world. It's also a European problem. And that's something we need to focus on. But things that are lacking there, and the representative of the Council and the Commission mentioned that as well. It's the need for a global agreement, for a global consent. Without that, we will end up in an impasse. We mentioned that we need to help the poorest countries. Yes, that's fine. But if you look at the figures today, if you look at the production of greenhouse gases, you will see that no matter how ambitious Europe is, even if we turn off everything that we use, we won't change anything in terms of climate changes. We haven't got the slightest chance to mitigate this global effect. We mustn't talk just about China, but also other fast developing economies, Mexico, Brazil, Southern America, and especially India. I can't imagine the future approach by India, and let's admit it, what I have heard is not exactly wonderful. I would like to emphasize here that unless we reach a global agreement, all of our efforts will just become a burden for the European economy. It will be just a masochistic liquidation of European competitiveness. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now, for the GUI NGL group, Mrs.
Thank you, President. We must support the developing countries in adapting themselves. to climate change. This is a phenomenon for which they are not responsible, but from which they are suffering disproportionately. The developing countries don't have the resources to tackle climate change that we do have in Europe. As we approach the United Nations discussions in Copenhagen, what is necessary is genuine and practical solidarity. This solidarity must be expressed through financial and technological support. And this support must come on top of our normal overseas development aid. What is given with one hand must not be taken away with the other. The developing countries must play a full participating role in the financial mechanisms for distributing this financial aid. One of the most important yardsticks with regard to assessing the Copenhagen deal is to see how it can help the developing world in tackling or taking up the challenge of climate change. Important aid will be necessary to combat deforestation. It must be part of a comprehensive deal. Without financial solidarity and transfer of technology, we will not make the progress necessary. There is no doubt but climate change is speeding up and we have no time to lose. The result of climate change, unless we tackle it, will be disasters on a worldwide scale. The economic downturn should incite us to move faster towards the new economic, new green economy. We should not change our scientific approach. We should not drop the great willingness that we've had up to now. International action must be ambitious and must be embedded in the scientific reality of our days. We must go ahead and we must realize that it isn't the developing countries that created these problems. We are the ones who created them.
Teraz pani Anna Rosbach, Europa Wolności i Demokracji. Bardzo proszę. Minuta, 1 minuta.
Thank you, President. The Environment Committee last night adopted a wish list for Father Christmas in Copenhagen. There are many things on the list which are well meant and very lofty things, but can the Father Christmas alias the Commission, are there possibilities for all these well meant wishes when 500 million Americans are worried about health, unemployment, 2.5 billion Chinese and Indians want the same living standards as we have in Western Europe. We don't have influence on the activities of the sun. That is very much responsible for the climate in our planet. In other words, what can the Commission realistically do for all the 6 billion people on the earth to use less resources here and now? Thank you, President.
Wypowiedź. Teraz głos zabierze pan Nick.
Thank you very much. Nick Griffin for the non-attached, 1.5 minutes.
First,
okay.
The microphone is on. May I start again? There are two overriding themes in this place. First, concern with the growing gulf between the political elite and the ordinary taxpayers. Second, a hysterical obsession with man-made global warming. These two themes are intimately linked. The global warming fixation is a classic example of how the political class here is out of touch with the little people who have to pay the bills. While the EU backs the Copenhagen proposals to further the deindustrialisation of the West and the corporate domination of the Third World, a growing majority of ordinary people regard climate change as an elite scam, an excuse to tax and control us, and to impose internationalist dogma and global government at the expense of the nation state. Can you not see the danger in this growing gulf? It is time to look at the facts. Man-made global warming is an unproven theory based on manipulated statistics. The so-called consensus on the issue is the product not of debate but of the suppression of expert dissent. Before the political class and the green industrial complex dare to impose a single new tax, poisoned light bulb or useless wind farm on the ordinary taxpayer, they need to try to convince the public that global warming is man-made, that returning to the warmer climate of medieval times would be a bad thing, and that there is anything that Europe, as opposed to the United States, China and India, can do about it anyway. Either hold a debate and close the gap between you and the people, or don't complain when we nationalists, the ones who listen to the people, close it for you.
Panu za wypowiedź. W imieniu Rady pan...
Thank you. For the Council, Andreas Carlgren, please.
Herr talman, jag vill verkligen vända mig till...
Thank you, President. I will turn to all those who have participated in the debate. I would like to say thank you for the support for the important work being done by the EU on climate negotiations. We have an important responsibility. We need the Parliament's support to carry out our role. The efforts of Parliament, the Parliament's positions are very important for what we're doing. I would also like to say directly that I set great store by the fact that development issues have taken such a key role in the debate. I agree with the comments by Mr. FLORENZ that it is crucial that this shouldn't be just cosmetic. There shouldn't just be a beauty contest. It isn't an auction where we should outbid each other. It's about coming up with a robust architecture which in the long term will create some increased efforts for developing countries, and there we need a strong contribution from the EU. It also means that I agree with Mrs. De Keyser, who called to developing countries and called for 0.7% in development aid from developed countries. It's a question of solidarity, and the EU, as a rich region of the world, should show its strength and solidarity to Corinne Lepage. I agree that there is a need to have new efforts in what we do, but the support of the US will play a role because development problems are integrated. So we need to integrate development policy with climate policy. Now, on deforestation of rainforests, I would want to have strong support in Copenhagen against deforestation of rainforests. We have a system called RED, which is very important here. Those who deny the climate problem, those are actually those who are passing on the bill to ordinary people. It's also a way of hiding the problem, hiding the fact that there is a bill to pay that applies to both developed countries and EU and developing countries, where the poorest people will be hit hardest by the degradation of the climate. In line with what Mr. FLORENZ said, we need to have cooperation with developing countries, but we also need to have pressure to get emissions down as far as possible. It's important that we tackle emissions emissions themselves, and we have the most ambitious, the most long-term goal in the world, and we must now ensure that we get others up to our level. The economic crisis is an excellent opportunity to increase investments in new green efforts, new green products, new companies producing greenly, new jobs created by green efforts. That will renew our economy. We are assuming leadership towards a plastic-free economy, and that's important. We shouldn't take a shortcut in industrialization. You can introduce plastic-saving industries. We have responsibility for the most vulnerable, but these rapidly growing economies, including China, they must make their contribution to solving the climate's problems. But with that approach, we in the EU will be able to play a leading role in coming up with an ambitious agreement.
Commissioner De Gucht, bardzo proszę.
Commissioner De Gucht, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. President of the Council, dear colleagues, first of all, what I have noticed in the debate is that all political groups agree on the principles that we should put forward in Copenhagen. I think this is a very important feature. It's not very common that in a parliament with so many political parties and political groups you nevertheless have an unanimous support for what you are proposing. Secondly, this was amongst others Mr. Florenz who was saying this, there should not be a competition of bids on the table. It's about commitments. It might be true, but on the other hand I think it is important that we have put a bid on the table and that we say, look, we are ready to do this, provided of course that we get the green light from the European Council later this month. This is not simply a competition, it's about an engagement of the European Union, and we are looking forward that also the other political heavyweights and the economic heavyweights would put bids on the table, which is up to now not the case for several amongst them. And we understand that the situation of the United States is not very easy at this moment in time, but it is important that they put a bid on the table so that we can negotiate, because if not we would continue the deadlock that we fear to be in at this moment in time.
I think it's true that developing countries are the ones that are the most affected by the economic crisis, and they are not responsible for this economic crisis. And it's also true that they are hard hit by climate change. That is why we have to show full solidarity to these developing countries. But it's not just developing countries that we're going to have to support against this backdrop. I think that we're going to have to be very bold when it comes to our own industries. I'm talking about the economic players in our countries. When we talk about deforestation in developing countries, EU member states have to shoulder their responsibility as well. Now, we will need legislation with an extraterritorial dimension, so that we don't find ourselves in a situation where on the one hand we're coming up with mitigation and adaptation as well as climate finance, that on the one hand, and then on the other there are economic players that are working against this in the developing countries.
The important topic that we will have to tackle also amongst us, because one of the big fears is that the 0.7 would be reached by adding adaptation efforts, to put it clearly. I mean, already now in the ODA you have a lot of topics which are adaptation, and that's quite normal, and that of course will continue, but we should find a measuring mechanism by which we can clearly distinguish the present efforts we are making from the additional efforts that have to be made for climate change, and that's something, Mr. President, that we will certainly have to come back to after Copenhagen. Thank you.
Bardzo dziękuję panu.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Also, thank you for being brief. We have time pressures. We're behind a bit. Now we have the other speakers. Mrs. Wortmann-Kool, 2 minutes.
Voorzitter, na 10 jaar praten zijn we nu dicht bij de
President, after 10 years of debate, we're approaching the Copenhagen conference. It's just 50 days in which to arrive at an ambitious agreement with binding targets, not just for Europe, but for the United States and countries like China and India. When you have ambitious agreements, there needs to be appropriate funding in place, and I already said that in the debate. It shouldn't just apply to the EU. All countries need to make financing proposals so that developing countries are able to take part in this climate agreement. Solidarity with the poorest must be part and parcel of this climate agreement. The Commission rightly has been a pioneer in terms of funding Mr. De Gucht, but what Mr. FLORENZ was saying was that in Parliament we're currently seeing a bidding war on this issue, and the question is whether it's a useful contribution. Indeed, a challenge was laid down to the Member States for them to take action, and I would like to thank the Swedish Presidency for the efforts it's made in this direction. But the US and the emerging economies now also need to do their bit in this work. You can count on our support. But in Europe, a lot of ideas are floating around. We've much to do. We have to be a class leader in terms of emissions standards, but when it comes to technological innovations in the sustainable economy, we see that there is more to be done. We need encouragement for green innovation and business investment. I would expect more in that direction. The question of a European tax has been raised. We need to see businesses in the economy playing a greater part in terms of the necessary transition in Europe and worldwide.
2 minuty.
Mrs. Ulvskog, 2 minutes.
Andreas Carlgren, som ju är rådets representant.
I would like to thank Minister Carlgren. He said there are many who are pessimistic ahead of the Copenhagen meeting. I agree. I hope that a majority in this Parliament can ensure that the pessimism spoken about Mr. Carlgren and also exists in his own government doesn't win the day. There are two things we must deal with to win over the pessimists. We must finance the measures for development. The Commission's proposal is not enough. In 2020, we need at least 30 billion euros per year. Support is needed for restructuring, which must be on top of normal aid. I would like to ask if Andreas Carlgren has the Council behind himself when he speaks of his high ambitions. And then the 2 degrees goal. To do that, it's not enough for the industrialized world to bring down its emissions by 20%. Once again, we've heard a Council representative giving us this position. Many of us think that we need to bring down emissions by 30 to 40% by 2020. What does the Council want, and how will they reach their goal?
Charles Goerens.
Thank you very much. Mr. Charles Goerens.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. I think that there are three key issues in this debate. First of all, the Copenhagen summit is a bet for the future. There's a lot at stake. I'm not saying that everything depends on the EU, but without the determination that Mrs. Joly referred to, we won't be able to achieve anything. We also need determination. Now, we mustn't muddy the waters. When it comes to the impact of climate change on developing countries, I believe that the EU has to make sure it's credible. It did undertake a commitment in 2005 saying that by 2015 there will be 0.7% of GNP destined for ODA, and we must make sure that we don't water down this pledge. By using climate change as an excuse. Let me explain. The sums that will be pledged for developing countries in Copenhagen will have to be additional money, will have to be extra money. We've had a figure put forward, and that's 35 billion, and we're talking about an extra 35 billion euro. The EU has to make sure that there are no doubts about its determination to fight for the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals on the one hand and fighting against climate change on the other hand. If the EU were not to stick to this, then I think that would undermine the trust of developing countries in the EU. If we manage to reach an agreement on this, then the debate will not have been in vain. The third issue is that we need the United States, China, India, and all the industrialized countries, as well as developing countries and emerging countries. So we should envisage new north-south partnerships, especially when it comes to producing alternative energy. Harnessing solar power in order to produce electricity in the Mediterranean could become one of the big north-south projects in the future in order to deal with the economic crisis on the one hand and the climate crisis on the other. Of course, this shouldn't call into question the efforts that we should make in fighting against deforestation, and let me also say that emerging countries also have a great responsibility since they're members of the G20.
Thank you very much. Satu Hassi, please. Colleagues, a Finnish poet has compared humanity to people travelling into hell, but deny that they're in first class. Now there is a moment where we need leadership from the EU once again. The best way to ensure that we get a breakthrough in climate negotiations is that at the summit next week we make an offer to finance actions for the developing countries. We supported the amount of 30 billion euros yesterday in the Environment Committee. The 15 billion proposed by the Commission is not enough. If we are honest, we have to recognize our historical responsibility for climate change, and our emissions per person, per capita, are very much, many times those emitted by China and India, for example.
Thank you very much. Mr. Peter van Dalen, 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. President, this climate change summit needs to be a success. We need to speak with one voice as Europeans, and we need to be active in the negotiations. Copenhagen is important because it's about the future of the human race, which is going to be largely shaped by this climate change situation. There are a lot of countries barely contributing to degradation in the environment, but they're footing the bill as poor countries. Their villages are destroyed by cyclones, tornadoes, floods. Regions are laid waste to in one night. Our industrialized countries have broadly contributed to the worsening of the climate. We are responsible for sustainable funding and adequate funding for aid to countries in this area. What's also important is that there should be enough financial wherewithal from the EU. It's vital that these climate funds should have at least 15 billion a year, and other major economies need to do their bit too. President, I'm also happy that the President in office has mentioned deforestation. This is vital. We must fight deforestation. It is the way of reducing CO2 emissions.
Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Kartika Leotard. 1 minute. Thank you very much. Fortunately, in this climate change debate, or rather unfortunately, we haven't talked about deforestation, because forests help us offset carbon emissions, and in those countries where there is considerable deforestation, the CO2 emissions are a lot higher, and therefore the consequences of deforestation is that indigenous populations have to flee their land, and they can no longer continue living there. I think that we have to fund developing country projects in order to help them deal with the impact of climate change. Often it's a big industry in wealthy countries that feel that economic development, economic growth is a lot more important than social justice and social development. We have to put an end to deforestation. We have a moral obligation to help these countries.
Pan Oreste Rossi, 1 minute.
Mr. Oreste Rossi, 1 minute.
Presidente, onorevoli colleghi, ieri sera...
President, colleagues, the Northern League delegation was the only party to vote against this resolution in Parliament yesterday, and we did so because we thought it was Euro madness. At a time of an industrial crisis such as one we're living through, with losses in terms of competitiveness and jobs, thinking of funding the technological development of third countries, developing countries, would have been a body blow to European enterprise. By 2020, 30 billion euros would be given to countries such as China, India and Brazil, who are competitors, and we would be asking our industry to reduce emissions at the same time with a significant economic fallout. We can't have this sort of battle on environment when you have unfair competition from China and India and so on. We can't have a sustainable world market like that. We are standing beside workers and the business world as the Northern League, who are fighting the industrial megaliths of other countries who don't obey rules, and we're supposed to be funding them to the cost of our workers.
Bardzo proszę.
You have 1.5 minutes, Mr. Zoltán BALCZÓ.
Now, what is the contribution of man to climate change? I think this link exists, and the climate conference in Copenhagen will make its contribution to that. The outcome will be political. The issue is, how can the big emitters be forced to reduce their emissions? Is the message from Europe not that we should reduce emissions by 30%? No. We should try to ensure that the US reduces its emissions. And there was an amendment to that effect in the Environment Committee. Many people think that Obama will come to Copenhagen. He did go to Copenhagen, but for a meeting of the International Olympic Committee to try to get the Olympics for Chicago. Why are we not more decisive? Only then can we achieve a breakthrough in a global issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Filip KACZMAREK. 2 minutes.
President, Minister, Commissioner, thank you. It's with great concern that I heard the information about the final document from the environment ministers. There was no attention paid to the crucial issue, which is how should we encourage third countries, developing countries, to make adjustments to climate change. It's a key question. There's no discussion either of the sums proposed by the Commission. I'm talking about the needs estimated at about 100 billion euros per year up to 2020, and the contribution from the EU to that sum. There was no discussion of that. The funding mechanism or co-funding mechanism by the member states of the EU wasn't even discussed, and we know that proposals in that area differ greatly. We can understand some arguments such as great caution must be exercised. We need to hear the proposals from other member states, other countries with strong economies. But if the EU really wants to be a leader in climate change efforts, then it needs to table hard and fast proposals. Because I think, at least partially, it's an internal issue for us. How do we view the funding mechanism? It needs to be a fair one. It's our duty to the developing countries to do that. These countries are the ones who have to bear the brunt of climate change, and they didn't contribute to making it. The infrastructure over there is often very poor. Agriculture is in a dire state, and for 4 years now, Africa, the poorest continent, is one facing the most climate change effects, and they've only got 12% of the funding which can be allocated to that objective. That's not the way of encouraging them.
Thijs BERMAN.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thijs BERMAN. 2 minutes. Thank you very much, President. In the Pacific, thousands of people have to move because their villages are being flooded. In Sudan, we have witnessed terrifying images, and what we must make sure prevails is the polluter pays principle when it comes to climate change. Now, the Copenhagen summit is going to try and flesh out this principle and make sure it becomes a reality. Oxfam says that when there isn't enough resources, then the revenue drops in these countries. Climate change is going to cost us 100 billion per year, and we have to help these countries to make sure that some Pacific states aren't wiped off the map, and so that people can continue living where they've always lived and where they want to continue living. Thanks to this assistance, hopefully we'll be able to promote development and stop deforestation and stop desertification. I think it's a shame that there aren't new funds, and if there are going to be new funds, we have to make sure that there is more. Some member states do not meet this ODA target, and the development budget in these countries is diminishing. So poorer countries are going to be paying for something that they never caused. We're going to have to come up with new financing tools in Copenhagen. Development policies will have to focus on climate change now. We need these policies to dovetail, and this has to be done in a transparent manner. Interruption.
De SARNEZ. 1 minute.
Mrs. Marielle de SARNEZ.
Du changement climatique, mais les pays en voie
the industrialized world is the main cause of climate change, but the poorest are paying the hardest. This is why the polluter pays principle requires us to make strong commitments at Copenhagen. It's important for us, but also for the southern European countries. We have been indebted to Africa in that respect for some time. We need to compensate them. In terms of technological change, Europe is present, but we need to help the countries adapt their economies to climate change, whilst at the same time thinking in terms of a radically different form of development policy. Africa needs a protected market so that finally it can put in place sustainable farming. It needs to protect its forests, its soil, its resources, and prevent them being pillaged by developing countries. Copenhagen will be successful only if we emphasize this message of co-responsibility and solidarity. Thank you.
Pani dziękuję również za czasowe.
Thank you very much, madam. Please make sure that you all stick to your speaking time. Mr. Yannick Jadot, 1 minute. Climate change has already led to 300,000 deaths. This is a crime against humanity. People are dragging their heels when it comes to negotiations. Australia, Norway, China, Brazil, South Africa and other countries are making efforts, but that is not the case when it comes to the United States, and unfortunately Europe isn't doing enough either. European ambitions would lead to global warming of 4 degrees if we continue like this. However, Europe holds the key to the Copenhagen summit. Minister, if the summit, in line with what the European Parliament is saying, takes the right decisions at the end of the month, then I think we should have our 30% target, and we have to provide developing countries with 35 billion euro. President in office, the way that some countries are using money to be given to developing countries like a negotiating weapon, then I think it's a shame. You mustn't play with people's distress.
Pan Sajjad Karim.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sajjad Karim, 1.5 minutes.
It is critical for an international consensus to be reached on tackling climate change and global warming. The Copenhagen summit provides us with an opportunity. But let's think for a moment of the problems facing this summit. The US, the world's biggest economy, has failed to agree to specific greenhouse gas emission reductions for 2020. And many other developed industrialized nations are uncertain as to whether the ambitious actions required are possible. Let us be clear. We really have no choice. The EU, in setting ambitious targets for 2020 and 2050, has acted courageously and must now urge others to do the same. We cannot meet our targets without cooperation from other states. The establishment of an effective global carbon market is crucial, as is international consensus, if we are to avoid the risk of protectionist measures relating to CO2 emissions within the EU. At Copenhagen, we must encourage courageous leadership from the national governments of large industrialized nations. Although individual states in the US have begun to tackle climate change, there is a woeful lack of leadership from the federal government. We need the US and emerging economies such as India and China to form a partnership with us for the future of our planet. We can encourage developing nations to follow a different, less environmentally damaging path of industrialization. They still have time to take a fresh approach that will be less environmentally damaging, and we must help them in the planning and building of the infrastructure that will achieve this.
Dziękuję panu. Pan João Ferreira.
Mr. João Ferreira, 1 minute. Thank you very much, President. Tackling the problem of climate change has to focus on the main issues, but unfortunately we only look at market solutions. Fossil fuels account for 85% of energy consumption, and that is why I believe that we have to diminish this dependence if we are to make progress. The main tool put forward by the EU is the carbon market, but I don't think that it's going to mitigate climate change. On the contrary, I think that it's going to be a stumbling block for a paradigm shift. The ETS did not reduce greenhouse gas emissions. On the contrary, I think that our focus is too market-based. Others talk about the regulatory framework and environmental protection. I think that the problems that mankind faces are so diverse that it's threatening life as we know it, but I don't think the solution lies in a rational system like this.
Jedna minuta.
Mr. Godfrey BLOOM, 1 minute.
Mr. President, I take the opportunity of wishing the East European cities well in the coming of the very early skiing season, and snow and ice that's come there, what of course is indicative of the fact that, as independent science has now confirmed, that the globe is actually cooling and has been cooling since 2002, broadly flat since 1998. We're all talking about something here which isn't happening. I've heard time and time again members here talk of CO2 as a pollutant. A pollutant is a life-giving natural gas. It gives me the impression that some of our members haven't had the benefit of a formal education. Isn't this really just about the state being able to get its hand in ordinary people's trouser pocket to steal yet more tax from them? Isn't this all about political control? Isn't all this about politics and big business? The whole thing's a sham. This bogus hypothesis, this ridiculous nonsense that man-made CO2 is causing global warming. Enough, please, before we damage irrevocably the global economy.
Dziękuję bardzo. Pan
Georg Bekali, 1 minute.
Domnule președinte, mă număr printre...
Thank you, President. I'm an MEP who believes that agriculture can bring about solutions. Agriculture is even a victim because droughts and floods affect everyone, but farmers even more. I'm also an MEP who believes that in the future we need a common agricultural policy. We need the CAP in order to develop new production models so that there can be real agricultural biodiversity, which has dropped by 70% since the beginning of the century. Agriculture is about human beings, animals, the forests, and the soil. It is inextricably linked to life, so we'll have to look at this during the Copenhagen summit. EU policy has to reflect the way that we deal with agriculture. Thank you very much. May God help us all.
Zeber.
Mr. Richard Zeber.
Thank you, President. Colleagues, we're talking about politics here and not about religion. So I think we should look at the facts or empirical facts and put hypotheses on the other side. One fact is that worldwide temperatures compared to pre-industrial times has increased by about 0.7% degrees. In the last 10 years, it's also a fact, the temperature has hardly risen. A second fact is that Copenhagen is an international conference and that the CO2 emissions of the community are about 17% of the worldwide emissions. We have legislation in place which says that by 2020 we'll cut by 20%. Look at the hypotheses now. The first one is that worldwide temperatures will continue to increase. The second hypothesis is that there is a direct link between CO2 emissions and temperatures in the air. But thirdly, that humanity can actually have an influence on the climate. And there are various scientific opinions on this. And I think this is a dilemma that we face as politicians, and we must make a decision. I think it would make more sense to have a second observation to help us with our politics, and this observation shows that all societies are very successful in working on energy efficiency, and I think it makes sense to have a policy which allows us to use energy and resources efficiently. within the community so that we can have this leading position internationally, but also to show other states, in particular developing countries, so we can help them along that path. If we look at the transfer of funds response suggested, this is a central point which is linked to lots of conditions under that would be just introducing a second approach to development aid.
Thank you, Mrs. Linda McEvan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't think Godfrey BLOOM heard the BNP speaker, but if he had, he would have seen that they have so much in common, as I always suspected. It was almost a carbon copy speech. Now, on polling, we heard something about polling. More than 2/3 of Europeans, in fact, in a recent survey, said that climate change was a very serious issue, and 20% said it was a fairly serious issue. For the UK, that same figure was 51% a very serious issue and 30% a fairly serious issue. That's 81%, and in fact only 10% of Europeans said it was not a serious issue at all. So I think the opinion polls show that people in Europe do care about climate change, they understand, and that is why all mainstream parties in this House are backing the Council and the Commission in Copenhagen, and why we backed the legislative package last year. Last night in the Environment Committee, 55-1 MEPs voted to back an ambitious negotiating position of the European Union in Copenhagen. On the financing side, which is extremely important this week, and we know the finance ministers meet today, we want funds, we want additionality, no double counting, and we want good governance structures. Sometimes in life you see things you never forget, and about 3 years ago myself and Fiona Hall went to northern Kenya, and we went to one of the poorest communities and we met pastoralist farmers there. We met young women, girls, who were being married at ever younger ages in northern Kenya. Why? Because when a young woman gets married in Kenya, in return for her hand in marriage, her father receives cows in payments because the currency is cows. Cows are becoming a rare commodity in northern Kenya, where people, because of climate change, we will never make poverty history unless we tackle climate change, and this House has a duty to respond to that call.
Thank you, Mrs. Marit Paulsen. 1 minute.
Herr minister, kommissionär och ärade ledamöter. Ungefär 40.
Thank you very much. 40% of CO2 gases come from production of foodstuffs. You could take the view that agriculture played a very wide role here. I think we need to take the position that agriculture is one of the keys to a solution of the problem. But, of course, the rich world has to dare to use new technologies. I think our agricultural policy needs to be stopped so that markets in developing countries are not destroyed any longer. We need to change farming. We need to ensure that agriculture works better. The speaker's been interrupted.
1 minuta. Next speaker, Karl Slüter. 1 minute.
Ni kommer hit gång på gång med fagert tal.
President, you give us nice speeches every time, but what is the actual content? The EU countries are faced by climate changes. They can turn round the pessimism created by the Council by coming up with concrete promises. I'm demanding the following. Will you give 50 billion euros a year to fight climate change? Will you do something about nuclear power? Do you accept special permits for developing countries? If you will promise all those things, you will also be able to bring down emissions by 40%.
Mr. Konrad SZYMASKI.
Thank you, President. The European Parliament's position on the distribution of tasks in relation to CO2 does not take into account real costs, specific costs. We negotiated the climate package, and these negotiations were extremely difficult, and I feel now that it's Central and Eastern European countries that have to bear the brunt of this. We're trying to impose rules that are deadly from economic point of view. I think that wealthy countries are not shouldering their share of the responsibility. It is not efficient or fair. We have to be careful, otherwise India or China will take advantage of this. We're being asked for 330 million euro up by 2015, and this means that Poland will have to pay 40 billion. This is crazy. This is economic folly, and it is calling into question our participation in certain areas of the EU. Then there's the issue of what is happening in Kaliningrad, very near Poland. In Kaliningrad, what you're imposing us is not being respected. Thank you very much. Thank you for sticking to your speaking time, and I would like to ask all the colleagues who will take the floor now to make sure they stick to their speaking time, because at 12 o'clock we're going to have to vote and we have to be punctual. Mrs. Matias, for 1 minute now.
Madam President, when it comes to an action plan to support developing countries in climate change, this is an issue of justice and fairness with the countries who are suffering from the problems we've created. I think we shouldn't just leave it at statements of intent. If we're going to be credible about the fundamental issues, then we must look at things like financing. There's no point being ambitious without clear objectives. We can't put in place a hard and fast strategy. There are estimates that we need 120 billion euro per annum to give to developing countries for each year. So we need serious resources, not just stopgaps. And we must ask who's going to fund these activities. We need courage to take on these problems. We need to involve all sides, the private sector, industry, and they're not going to give up on these things easily.
Thank you very much. Mr. Soini, for 1 minute.
Madam President, the climate mafia has been helped by the gullible Greens to transfer hundreds of billions of tax resources to developing countries, which will go to multinationals and to state companies in third countries. That is the type of climate policy we have now. China could shoulder its responsibilities itself. In terms of its currency resources, it's the richest country in the world. Madam President, Finland and the EU have to save their own steel, engineering and forestry industries by demanding that we should have a specific emissions system instead of the current emissions trading and percentage system. That's the right way to go ahead.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Del Castillo Vera for 2 minutes. Thank you very much, President. Thank you very much, Council. Thank you, Commission. On the issue we're discussing today, I would say that we have a set of certitudes and uncertainties. First of all, today most people agree that we have to cut CO2 emissions and that we have to develop clean energy technologies, clean sources of energy, I beg your pardon. We have to take a global and comprehensive approach. So if there is to be an international agreement, we have to make sure that they include the biggest CO2 emitters, China, India, Brazil, the United States, among others. Thirdly, the EU is putting a proposal on the table which is based on binding targets, 20% or 30% in other cases. My fourth point is that there is no clear signal that one of the big emitters, for very different reasons, are planning to accept this kind of agreement, and that's the reality. This lack of optimism is a problem. It will be pessimism that will prevail if we do not look at reality in the face and recognize what's happening. The only way forward is to acknowledge what is going on. That is the best way of being optimistic and hopeful. The EU has to play a leading role and therefore has the obligation to put complementary measures on the table. I'm talking about complementary proposals. Someone mentioned Japan here, and I would like to mention the sectoral approach idea, which has been extremely successful, that has achieved amazing results in Japan. These are realistic ways of tackling climate change. Copenhagen is an opportunity, but it will only be the opportunity of efficiency and not rhetoric that will prevail if we face reality. Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Joe Leinen has the floor for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Madam President. Mr. Carlgren has praised for its action in the forthcoming climate package, and we want to be more ambitious in future. Yesterday evening, the Environment Committee, by 55 votes in favour and 1 against, adopted a resolution which imposes ambitious goals for the negotiations in Copenhagen. And this shows that the ignorance and denial of climate change is a very small minority in this House, which doesn't need to be taken into account, but has been expressed many times, but which is actually against citizens in all European countries. The Earth atmosphere, it doesn't matter where the CO2 comes from. That means we need a global agreement for all countries, and not, as yet, has been argued in Bangkok that we should have many agreements, one for the US, one for Europe, one for the developing countries. That would be fatal. We need one global pact against climate change, and that means we need a worldwide pact of solidarity of rich countries with poor countries. That has been said on many occasions. We think that climate change is an opportunity not just for us, but also for developing countries to introduce a low resource development with modernized infrastructures, and Europe must help in that. In the financing, we've agreed with the demand that 30 billion euros are needed in 2020 from the EU, that financing instruments should be developed which are sustainable and calculable. They can't just come from budget funds. Other sources must be found. I would like to stress that shipping and aviation must be included, and of course agriculture and forestry have a significant share. Development and climate protection aren't in conflict, but rather they must be brought together in Copenhagen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gerbrandy has the floor for 1 minute.
Voorzitter, dank u wel. Uiteindelijk is er maar...
Thank you, President. There is ultimately one solution to climate change, technology. Only by using that technology will be in a position to maintain our lifestyles. But technological development is too slow, and the dissemination of technology is also too slow, particularly to developing countries. Climate is a global problem, but we're not pooling the best available technologies. This was a failure under Kyoto. Let's learn the lessons. Of course, we need to take into account intellectual property rights and the needs of pioneering companies in technology. Has to be compensated, but under the Montreal Protocol, a fund was established to this effect, and also last year there was work done on climate change in Accra. Perhaps the Commission could tell us what it thinks about this. And also we need to stop deforestation, but I note that there is a difference of views with respect to the European Union with regard to Austria, Finland and Sweden taking different views on deforestation to others. I'd like to hear views on that issue.
Mr. EICKHOUT for 1 minute. Thank you very much, Madam President. We're talking about climate change, but I think that we should be talking about human beings, because after all, human beings are the most affected, especially human beings in the least developed countries. In the Maldives there are floods, we have arid soil in Sudan with nothing growing. I think it's extremely important to think about this, and when we talk to investors who say that yes, we're investing, but we're only investing in emerging countries, we don't want to invest in vulnerable economies, then when we hear that, we have to be careful. That is why we need public finance to be given to developing countries. Now, I think that we have to push forward. It's extremely important to follow up the proposal of the European Parliament and ensure that we get at least 30 billion.
Nicholson.
Mr. Nicholson, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. The Climate Change Conference in Copenhagen in December presents us with a unique opportunity to address what is a very massive and huge problem. If we consider the consequences of global warming, it is obvious that the developing world is paying the price for environmental damage caused by the richer nations. Climate change is not the only environmental problem we face, but it is imperative that we attempt to address it in Copenhagen. It is the opportunity for the EU to speak with a one voice and find solutions to a problem which is affecting us all. All countries must play their part in terms of achieving targets. Sustainable development and developing world must be supported and encouraged, but targets set for these nations must be realistic. Can I, Madam President, say that I know there are others who hold a different view from the view that I hold, but I do not believe that we can afford to wait 50, 60, 70 years to find out who is right or who is wrong. We have a responsibility today to act now, to do what we can, while we are here, while we have that responsibility. Thank you, President.
Thank you very much. Mr. Agnew, for 1 minute.
What a relief that they've stopped burning heretics, or I'd be well and truly alight by now. I am, though, glowing hot in my opposition to the concept of man-made climate change. Carbon dioxide only accounts for 0.038% of our atmosphere, and only 4% of that is influenced by man's activity. It is a vital and irreplaceable food for plant life. The more plants receive, the faster they grow. A shortage of this gas will be far more serious than a surplus. The alarmist and incorrect statements that suggest any increase in carbon dioxide will create significant rises in sea levels is being used as an excuse by local authorities not to maintain low-cost wooden sea defences. When these inevitably rot after 40 years' service, nothing is done to repair them and homes are lost. This is creating an aura of despair amongst coastal communities. If computer predictions cannot forecast the weather properly in the short term, they have no place whatsoever in predicting long-term changes.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Jordan Cizeli for 2 minutes.
Zahvaljujem se ministru in komisarju za podani izjavi, me pa nekaj skrbi. Namreč to, da govorimo o...
Thank you, President. I'd like to air the following concerns. We're talking about quantitative goals until 2020 or 2050, respectively, and experts say that in 2050, that is when these targets will be achievable. I wonder what the Commission thinks about that. Secondly, in Copenhagen, we need a holistic agreement that includes all countries. It's not enough if Europe alone uses this technology, and if emissions in other countries continue to rise, I'd be interested to hear from the Commissioner what sort of arguments should be applied to encourage the developing countries to shoulder their responsibilities, and how can carbon leakage be dealt with. We can't close our eyes to reality, because emissions of carbon cannot be reduced in the short term. Countries aren't going to abandon coal in short order, particularly when it comes to developing countries. So in international negotiations, we need to address the efficient use of fossil fuels. Europe can do something now. We can make a financial contribution on a greater scale in the 7th Framework Programme, the aim of which is to fight climate change.
Thank you very much. Mr. Groote, you have 1.5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam President, President in Office, colleagues. I think climate change will be with us for a long time, longer than the economic and financial crisis. There are parallels. Both of them will cost a lot of money. And this is what this is all about in Copenhagen, is to get agreement as regards the financial instruments for the third world, for developing countries. The conference in Copenhagen must be a success, and we can contribute to that. Yesterday, we did a good deed. We had a big majority behind the resolution in the Environment Committee, and I think in the Parliament as a whole, this resolution will get a large majority. So, to change the political climate in the way up to Copenhagen, and that has to do with psychology, and we have to work together. One concrete effort is ahead. In the Parliament, we've managed to we've dealt with incorporating aviation into emissions trading, and we've done that successfully. Looking to the Commission and Council, this should be pursued consistently in Copenhagen. That was an international agreement that shipping and aviation should be included in a subsequent protocol to Kyoto. These emissions in these sectors are contributing disproportionately to the warming of the climate, and the 2-degree limit, that isn't the end. That isn't the end of the parallels with the economic crisis. We can't turn back the clock as regards the planet.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gallagher, for 1 minute.
We must look at the opportunities that can flow from striking a comprehensive international agreement in Copenhagen so that we can effectively arrest climate change. The Union is committing to ensuring that 20% of all our energy needs will come from the renewable energy sector by 2020. Europe, and indeed my own country, Ireland in particular, can become world leaders in developing new and innovative wave and tidal technologies. The development of such technologies are vital components of our strategies to achieve our climate change targets. We must ensure that we maximise funding under the 7th and 8th EU Research and Technology Framework Programmes between now and 2020.
Investment in green technology will contribute to creating jobs in Europe, despite the economic recession. We are aware of the huge difficulties that we will face if we do not live up to our international duty. We must face the challenge, and we must face it responsibly and diligently.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gallagher. Mr. Turmes, for 1 minute.
Russian roulette? Have you ever played Russian roulette? Of course not, because you have 1 chance in 6 to be dead or to be hurt. If Copenhagen is not a success, we have not even a 50% chance to keep this planet not going to dangerous climate change. Why are we in this impossible situation? We have basically lost 20 years. 20 years from the big Rio conference. 20 years of dirty industries, from oil to coal to car, lobbying us. 20 years of the centre-right in the US and in Europe making it too difficult for Greens and others to push an ambitious agenda. The next week's European summit and Copenhagen is the last occasion for the centre-right in Europe, with the Swedish presidency, the Danish one, France and Germany being ruled by centre-right politicians, to act responsible. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Sonik for 2 minutes. Thank you, President. The EU should play a leading role in the fight against climate change. We really must spearhead this process of setting priorities for CO2 emissions. In the preparatory phase, in the run-up to Copenhagen, we have pledged more than other countries. No other power has put forward such a proposal with quantitative and qualitative objectives in order to cut CO2 emissions and support new clean technologies. The EU can only play a credible role in the negotiations if it sets or proposes realistic objectives and targets that can lead to a global compromise. The EU now needs allies to support its proposals. That is why we have to proceed cautiously if we want to increase the commitment of 20%, from 20% to 30%. Looking around, I don't think there are other countries that are ready to accept such ambitious targets. Our support to developing countries has to be based on realistic action. It shouldn't just be about lofty intentions. It has to be about more than that. We have to set up a fair support mechanism that will help other countries face the future. Another important thing for Europe is that we mustn't forget that the preparatory work for Copenhagen has to go hand in hand with a clear communications policy. We have to make sure that there is no gulf between us and the citizens. It's very important. Thank you. Thank you very much. Please stick to your speaking time, colleagues, because we have to vote at noon. Mr. Cashman for 2 minutes.
And I will keep my CO2 emissions down, and I'll be brief. Commissioner, it's good to see you in place. Presidency, it's good to see you here. Talk of 2020, 2050, not good enough. We need agreement and achievement now, because climate change is placing poverty reduction at risk. We are seeing the diversion of ODA budgets from development, and that is unacceptable and puts at risk our Millennium Development Goals, which must be achieved. At Copenhagen, we will see 27 countries acting as one to achieve ambitious targets. We've heard the climate change deniers here in this House, and let me just say this. Talks of plants and CO2. There's deforestification, there's desertification. This means that in some places there is no water, there are no trees. Climate change kills. It is as simple as that. So therefore, let us be clear. Member States should maintain their 0.7% of GNI for development and cap any use of that GNI at 10% maximum, and then bring in the additional funds necessary to beat and defeat climate change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Hall for 1 minute.
Madam President, I'm concerned that the Commission's calculations on international climate finance are just smoke and mirrors. First, it's claimed that 90% of energy efficiency measures can be financed by developing countries themselves. That's €30 billion per annum. In the EU, the biggest obstacle to introducing energy efficiency measures for both governments and for individual citizens is the lack of upfront financing. Why does the Commission believe that developing countries can finance efficiency measures without upfront funding when EU member states themselves have struggled to do so? Also, the idea that the international carbon market can fund €38 billion a year is unrealistic. We've seen how slow the EU ETS carbon market has been to get off the ground and how badly the carbon price has been thrown off course by the economic crisis. It's likely to be many decades before there is a properly functioning international carbon market. So we do need a new and additional financing measure now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hall. Mrs. Grosstedt for 2 minutes. Thank you very much, Madam President. We've been saying this all morning, but let me say that climate change is tantamount to deforestation, desertification, natural disasters, famine, poverty, especially in southern countries. And it's also about migration. The Copenhagen summit needs to strike a balance among 4 objectives. First of all, we have to cut greenhouse gas emissions, but at the same time not bring our economies to a standstill, promote new technologies and put an end to environmental dumping. We have to help poorer countries, and let me draw your attention to developing countries. We have the most advanced developing countries, but this term doesn't exist in international texts. These countries are included in the overall umbrella of developing countries. They're not considered to be countries that are more advanced developing countries and that can contribute to the effort of greenhouse gas emissions cuts, even though they are very carbon hungry, if you like. China, Brazil and other countries, they have to make commitments in Copenhagen as well, and make similar commitments to those made by industrialized countries. They're very different to the rest of the developing countries. CO2 emission cuts have to be shared out in a fair manner to make sure that we don't distort competition. We also have to stimulate the deployment of new technologies, and there has to be a significant investment in research and development. We have to create the right conditions for sustainable trade among countries, and we have to promote new technologies in the least developed countries and recognize intellectual property rights and open up markets to these new technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Guerrero Salmon. The most dramatic crises in the world are the effects of climate changes and the financial crisis, and these will be more closely linked in future. These are more devastating each day which goes by. There are many more poor now than a year ago. Tens of thousands more. The effects of climate change are more serious, more intensive than they have ever been in the past. We are a month and a half away from Copenhagen, and in Copenhagen we will have to make a huge effort. We'll have to put more effort into the fight against climate change, but not with the resources that we spend on development aid now, and not with the resources we now use for educational health. The developing countries need more resources, so we have to go further than the 0.7% of GDP. That has been the message from various leaders at the recent meeting of the UN, and that was the message of the President of the Spanish government as well. Thank you very much. Mr. Liese, you have the floor.
Frau Präsidentin.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mr. Commissioner, colleagues, at a meeting a few days ago in Brussels with Health Commissioner Vassiliou and healthcare experts across Europe, there was an event on Climate Change and Health. It was entitled Prescription for a Healthy Planet. The President of the European Medical Association described the Earth as being like a patient with a serious illness. The later you leave treatment, the more difficult the treatment it is. Moreover, if you leave it too late, then the patient will not survive. Thus, with our patient, the Earth, we need to act quickly, and I hope we succeed. But climate change is not just something that affects some. It affects all states and all economies. What's happening is we're placing a major burden on traditional European industry, which is responsible for only 50% of CO2 emissions. Hence Amendments 198 and 202 on incorporating aviation and shipping in the emissions trading scheme. Council and Commission need to do more. At the EU summit ahead of Pittsburgh, and in fact Pittsburgh itself, there was no significant progress. Commission and Council must do more. Other regions of the world must also do more. I welcome the Nobel Peace Prize for Barack Obama, but if he doesn't go to Copenhagen, if he doesn't come to Copenhagen with a decent offer, then he will lose credibility.
Lise? Thank you, Mr. Lise. Mr. Arsenis, you have the floor.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, κυρία Πρόεδρε. Οι αναπτυσσόμενες χώρες έχουν
Thank you very much, Madam President. The developing countries have offered very little while they're still causing the worst effects. There are millions of people who have to move ever further to get firewood and water and food. These are people depending on natural ecosystems, and they haven't played any part in climate change themselves. In these places, the African deserts, for example, what you have is something extremely important for the rest of humanity. We're talking now about 3 times as much carbon as the developed countries are now emitting. Because of the areas of these, the areas covered by these forests, we have to attach political priority to them so as to help the developing countries to fight against climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Arsenis. Mr. Skylakakis. Thank you, Madam President. I'd like to adopt a position on the subject of the marine environment, which is very important in connection with Copenhagen. I'd like to say 2 things. First of all, it would be a great mistake if we were to neglect shipping and leave it as an isolated thing. Shipping is a very environmentally friendly form of transport. We have to develop special routes, and shipping is a very competitive sector. And we shouldn't forget about it and give priority to road transport. We have to remember the developing countries because they are based on the production of raw materials and agricultural products, and they need this particular type of transport. The question, of course, is whether we can finance this type of transport. I'd also like to say another thing. The Greens group didn't come to the discussion yesterday on the objectives for shipping. And Is it really more environmentally friendly to travel on the motorways in large luxury cars? Thank you, Mr. Skylakakis. You didn't even use up your full speaking time. Mr. Parnio, 2 minutes.
Madame la Présidente, Monsieur le...
Madam President, Mr. President in Office of the Council, Commissioner, it is a challenge for humanity and for future generations. Copenhagen, to pick up that challenge, needs to strike a unique agreement, as the chairman of the Environment Committee has just said. An alliance between industrialized countries and emerging countries is needed. Our debate and our resolution once again appeal to the European Union to retain its leadership role in this necessary fight against climate change. We all need to speak with one voice if we are to maintain our credibility. We need at Copenhagen an agreement to limit the increases in world temperatures to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We also need in Copenhagen an agreement for collective reductions of greenhouse gases by 30% in 2020. But that's not enough. It's necessary that developed countries should considerably reduce their emissions, certainly, but also that developing countries need to make a contribution. The industrialized countries should therefore give financial and technical support, a sufficient and sustainable support, a foreseeable, forecastable, predictable support to the developing countries so as to help them to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. And Copenhagen must also allow the developing countries to develop towards carbon-poor development models. Then there are other things. We need a world-level financing arrangement to fight greenhouse gases through a tax on their emissions. Then we need to stop the kind of carbon leakage that we might suffer in Europe. We need a fiscal adjustment, therefore, on the import of carbon-rich products. And that carbon tax collected at European borders could then pay for investment in the necessary infrastructure for the fight against climate change.
Thank you, Mr. Parnio. Mrs. Dati has.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. The last G20 meeting was an opportunity for Europe to be in the driving seat of the future global economy. Europe will also have a major responsibility in Copenhagen, an opportunity to show the world the path to follow. I've been hearing from I've been hearing what my Green colleagues have to say. Since the adoption of the energy climate package, Europe has been pointing the way to an environmentally sensitive future with specific and ambitious answers to the climate change challenges. Copenhagen will have to be based on a shared responsibility, but differentiated responsibility. It's up to us, the industrialized countries, to do the necessary to make sure that our developing country partners have the resources to follow us on this ambitious path to combat climate change. We also have to serve as an example. We have to commit ourselves to an 80% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2050. It's not enough, but it's a good start. We also have to lay the groundwork for the developing countries to be able to participate alongside us in this joint effort. So we have a responsibility, but we have duties towards these countries. Everybody needs to be involved to meet this major challenge, but not everybody is able to do as much as everybody else. Not everybody has the same history, but thanks to a real contribution, more than just words, everybody can do their bit at Copenhagen, and the EU will be judged accordingly. If there are no binding results from Copenhagen, we in Europe will have to impose a carbon tax on our external borders. That will be the only way for our virtuous commitment to be respected by the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Dati. Mr. Podimata. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. We have important challenges to face up to. A fortnight ahead of Copenhagen, will we manage to agree that we really assume responsibility for the worldwide financing of the fight against climate change in the developing countries? Europe has already taken great steps towards doing this. There are different sources of financing and organisation, and now we need to exert pressure on the other countries so that we can help the developing countries to assume responsibility, because the support of the efforts of the developing countries is very important regarding its impact on climate change. It's a chance to fight against worldwide imbalance in development and to narrow the gap between poverty and the rich countries. Also in the European Union, we are about to set up a new group of climate refugees who are not protected by anyone. They have no rights. They're not protected by anyone. And we need to provide support to climate refugees. This is an important task for the international community. The European Union must protect them. Thank you, Mr. Carvalho.
Madam President, Minister, Commissioner, the European Union will have to carry on in a leadership role in the international negotiations aiming to achieve an ambitious agreement in Copenhagen. That agreement will have to be based on the principle of joint but differentiated responsibility, and that must also be applied, that principle, to the developing countries. Their stage of development, their circumstances are different, so they need different measures cut to the cloth of each. All of these measures, all of these countries will have to have national strategies for low-carbon development. The developing countries will have costs in the order of 100 billion euros to reduce their emissions and to adapt themselves to the impact of climate change. Some of that finance will come from the private sector, but some of it will also have to be public and international in addition to development aid. It's urgent to establish the structure of such a financing system and work out what the origin of these sums will be if there is to be an agreement in Copenhagen. The clean development mechanism in the Kyoto Protocol, on the other hand, should be reformed so that credits are only given to projects which provide extra reductions. The more advanced developing countries and the more competitive industries there should be gradually excluded from the mechanism. The mechanism then essentially being open to the poorest countries, particularly African ones. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Paleckis.
Thank you, President. The European Union sets an example to other continents while tackling threats that hover above our planet. The fight against climate change is yet another proof of that. The EU is ready to continue to be a leader in this area, but all the countries that are going to take part in the Copenhagen conference must join this fight. Developing countries need additional help. Their economic growth, as well as the growth of the BRIC countries, must be based on green technologies. We should focus more on sharing advanced technologies and knowledge. The EU should set an attractive example not only by assuming commitments to reduce emissions, but also in promoting renewable energy, increasing energy efficiency. And let us not forget that in the European Union there is also a considerable gap between countries who are successful in implementing new technologies and those who lag behind. And we should unite our efforts in closing this gap and thus setting a good example to all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Mrs. Korhola, 2 minutes.
Madam President, we need to admit to a number of facts. First of all, our climate efforts hitherto have led to nothing. The strategy has been ineffective because emissions have grown in absolute and relative terms. Contrary to expectations, global carbon intensity has grown at the same time as great efforts have been made to reduce it. The statistics show that countries which have ratified the Kyoto Protocol have not reduced their emissions per ton of production any better than those outside the protocol. We've got a bad agreement. We need a more comprehensive one, a more effective one, a more ambitious one. At the same time, we have to admit that we know less than we thought. The temperature has not been increasing in line with the emission growth. Temperature growth has stopped and the cooling is expected to continue. This doesn't mean, however, that we can rest on our laurels. We need to know more. We need more research. We need sensible emissions measures whether or not there is global warming. The United Nations Millennium Report should serve as the basis because it doesn't just concentrate on carbon. Thirdly, we're in the midst of an economic crisis. That means we have a responsibility to citizens. We have to be sensible, we have to be efficient. We can't have a bad climate agreement. We can't have a climate agreement which simply moves emissions from one place to another, doesn't reduce them. At the moment, it's production, not consumption, that is the yardstick for emissions, and that means that carbon emissions can be relocated. That means that while locally emissions are reduced, globally they can increase. Everybody has to contribute to reducing the carbon economy. We can't have dirty production anywhere. We don't want to create any more loopholes in EU law such as we have in the emissions trading scheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Korhola. Mr. Padar, 1 minute.
Madam President, ambitious climate measures would help in softening the blow of the present economic crisis thanks to new jobs and economic growth. The International Energy Agency also believes we need an ambitious agreement in Copenhagen because the crisis has delayed environmentally sensitive investment in the energy sector. I think there are opportunities here for my country, Estonia, as well. We need a comprehensive energy saving program and we need an ambitious and long-term approach to renewable energy. But that's not enough. We should also rethink our transport and logistics arrangements. We should use more environmentally friendly construction materials and technologies, reduce our dependence on chemicals, do something about packaging in the retail industry, and develop organic agriculture. These are all great sectors for the future, and we simply need to be creative in how we go about them.
Thank you, Mrs. Gardini, 2 minutes.
Thank you. There's been a lot of talk about the vote yesterday in the Environment Committee. But I'd like to point out that you can't put everything down to one extreme ideological position. We've heard some very varied and nuanced positions, very common sense positions this morning. Those are more in line with reality, more likely to provide realistic answers. Science is not Unitarian. If you pick out one problem in an ideological way, then you always get disastrous policy responses. Europe needs to stand together on this. The directive, the emissions trading directive itself, says that what the Union does should be assessed by the Commission on the basis of the outcome of the conference. So we need to go to the conference with strong positions, with clear ideas, to be sure, but we need to divide efforts fairly among, firstly, the industrialized countries, which need to accept equivalent emission reduction efforts, but we should also not forget what Mrs. Grosstedt very rightly pointed out. The developing countries now need to be subject to distinctions between them. Some of them are now better described as emergent economies, India, China, Brazil, and they must face up to commitments of their own. It seems to me that if a balanced outcome is not achieved in Copenhagen, are we going to? We must carry on with free award of quota to sensitive industries as under the 2003 directive. The Kyoto Protocol must continue with its environmental contribution, and we mustn't end up undermining the financial position of European companies.
Thank you, Mrs. Gardini. Mr. De Pey, on 1 minute. Thank you, Madam President. The problem of financing the developing countries, as we've heard on several occasions this morning, their fight against climate change, could cause a collapse at Copenhagen, although we all hope that the summit will be a success. However, as we know, these countries are often the main victims of global warming, for which they are not responsible. The industrialized countries have provided financial aid of a considerable quantity, but it is still inadequate, and even the amounts announced will not be enough, and that will oblige us to find new sources of financing. The Environment Committee, following the Development Committee, adopted the idea that it is now necessary to consider a tax on financial transactions similar to the Tobin tax. A tax of 0.01% could produce $100 billion a year, which we think are the needs looking ahead to the year 2020 for the fight against climate change in developing countries. The European Parliament, following certain national leaders assuming responsibility, has assumed its responsibility. I'd like to know what the Commission and Council think. Thank you very much, Mr. Payon. Mrs. Eck, 1 minute.
Tack, fru talman. Världen slåss nu med 3 stora kriser.
Thank you, Madam President. The world is facing 3 crises: the economic, the employment, and the climate crisis. And we need to take political decisions that deal with all 3 challenges. This is a major challenge for our businesses, but taking the right decisions and taking well thought out decisions would give us the opportunity to create a new global environmentally sustainable economy. All of humanity should benefit from a deal in Copenhagen, but we in Europe should campaign for idealistic solutions. The Americans and the Chinese are motivated by other factors. But what is important is that we need solutions which give people freedom and which give consumers the opportunity to act in full knowledge on the market.
Thank you very much. So much for the pre-announced speakers. Now we come to the Catch the Eye procedure. Many colleagues have asked for the floor. Please stick to your speaking time, which is 1 minute each. That way as many speakers as possible can speak. Mr. Niculescu first.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Deforestation, which has been mentioned here, is a phenomenon which affects developing states. But before blaming these countries, we must be aware that deforestation sometimes is caused by survival needs. I'd like to point to your attention the conclusions of a study which shows that at least half of the agricultural area in the world is only covered by forests to the amount of 10%. And I think this is enough to realize that this vegetation is very important. It's clear that farmers would protect forests more if they had more financing in order to do so. Another thing which we might take into consideration is systems of associating trees and cultures. These systems, which are less profitable than monocultures, are often abandoned. In order to avoid deforestations, we must compensate European farmers which practice this type of stratified culture.
Κυρία Μέρκιες έχει το λόγο για 1 λεπτό παρακαλώ.
Mrs. Merches, 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Success or failure, that is the question. We're living in a time of all kinds of crises, already have been mentioned, but one has been forgotten next to the climate, to the global warming, and that is a crisis of public confidence in politics. And therefore, indeed, Mr. Carlgren, I agree with you, let's not make this into a beauty contest about who's more or less ambitious, realistic or less realistic, or more or less willing to pay. We need 4 clarities because too much is at stake. We need a clear and ambitious political stance. We need a clear commitment. We need a clear path and clear deadlines. And last but not least, we need clarity on financial support. If Copenhagen is not a complete success, let's not cry wolf and start naming and shaming, but set out a clear process and time path in order to come to a result. Let's show we are reliable and responsible, both in target setting and in a fair financial perspective.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ο κύριος Watson θα πάρει το λόγο τώρα.
Mr. Watson, please.
Thank you, Madam President. President, we talk a lot about the melting of the ice caps, but there is not only the Arctic and the Antarctic, there is also the third pole, the Himalayan glaciers, which give water to some 2 billion people, almost a third of the world's population in India and China and in the subcontinent. These glaciers are retreating fast because of black carbon coming largely from industrialization, but also from fossil fuel-powered generators, and will deprive of water for both drinking and irrigation many millions, indeed many billions of people. The European Union needs to recognise that help is going to be needed to improve the quality of the machinery that is being used and to cut down its polluting impacts. I believe this should be put on the agenda for Copenhagen, but it should also be put on the agenda for the forthcoming European Union summit with India and other summits with the countries affected. Unless we help them, we will not be able to prevent the melting of the Himalayan glaciers and serious problems of water provision for a third of humankind.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ, κύριε Watson.
Thank you, Mr. Watson. Mr. Matula.
Mulțumesc, doamnă președintă.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We live on a planet which is characterized by a diversity of the environment, but climate change affects the whole globe, and reality shows that the effects of climate change do not take into account borders and affect all of us in various ways, through droughts, floods, or storms. The main cause of these disasters is uncontrolled development of certain activities, and this leads to increased CO2 emissions and global warming. Current statistics show that the emissions of CO2 per head can be hundreds of times greater for the developed countries compared to developing countries. And I would like to ask a rhetorical question. Is it or not our duty to support the developing countries with new technologies in order to ensure a clean planet? I think the answer is obvious, and we need to go to concrete measures with no delay. Thank you.
Μην ξεπερνάτε το 1 λεπτό σας παρακαλώ, δυσχεραίνετε τη συμμετοχή άλλων.
Please stay within 1 minute, otherwise we won't be able to allow other people to speak. Mrs. Jaakonsaari.
Παρακαλώ. Η κυρία Jaakonsaari, Lisa.
Mrs. Lisa Jaakonsaari.
Oikeudenmukainen siirtyminen vähähiiliseen maailmaan eri.
It's important that we move towards a low-carbon economy in a just way, and the political system has a vital role to play, because the market isn't necessarily fair and just. That's why we have the Copenhagen meeting. I regret that Minister Dahlgren's got so many priorities that I'm not quite sure what the priority is. What's going to be done for low-income households? What can be done for low-income households in Europe? Has any European member state thought about the more flexible use of structural funding in order to bring about green structural change in our society? It's not enough to save the world, we have to save people too.
Ο κύριος Γιόρκ έχει το λόγο. 1 λεπτό παρακαλώ.
Mr. York, 1 minute.
Köszönöm a szót, elnök asszony. A közelgő koppenhágai klímacsúcs egyik kulcsfontosságú témája lehet az erdőgazdálkodás. Ez nem véletlen.
One of the main questions may be the forestry economy. There's nothing new about this, but what we see is that there is more carbon emission than is due simply to transport. Reports suggest that world forestry production is about 40% illegal, and we can see that it's a lot of this is in the tropics, but not necessarily all. A recent study showed that Hungarian wood production is largely illegal. So we need to make sure that there is not this illegal production, and there are not also forest fires. We need to ensure that all forestry economic rules are observed. We need at Copenhagen to make sure that forestry is part of the system of protection. Mrs. McGuinness, 1 minute, please.
Thank you, President. The issue of food security needs to be mentioned in this debate on climate change for the developing world in particular. It is very difficult to ask people to look at climate change mitigation if their basic needs for food are not met. I think we need to allow them use the best available technology to produce food in a sustainable way which does not harm the environment and tackle the issue of climate change. I have one concern in relation to the World Trade Organization and a deal on agriculture which does not take into account the impact, for example, of the deforestation in Brazil as they supply beef into the European Union. These are very complex issues. We could perhaps solve a problem in one place and create it elsewhere. So we obviously do need a global agreement which tackles climate change, but we also need to recognise the very, very serious issue of food security. Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ο κύριος Brons έχει το λόγο.
Thank you, Mr. Blooms.
Hello. The evidence isn't that rising levels of CO2 lead to temperature rises, but that the causal connection's the other way around. But of course we mustn't let facts get in the way of a good story. However, let's accept for the moment that man-made emissions are a bad thing for various reasons. Why then does the British Labour Party support aggressive and illegal wars that not only kill British soldiers, Iraqis, Afghans and in the future Iranians, but they also produce vast increases in global emissions? Thank you.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ.
Thank you, Mrs. Estrela. Copenhagen, Madam President, is the great opportunity for a world agreement in good time. For the first time in the United States, we have an administration which is committed to looking for solutions, and there are good signals coming from other countries, such as Japan, for example. But we need a new approach to climate change, which takes into account the consequences of that change on security, on economic recovery, on migration, and even on fighting terrorism. And let's not forget that climate change requires a contribution from science, from technology, and from the economy. The greatest obstacle to an agreement in Copenhagen is finance. There will not be an agreement if there is not finance for the adaptation of the developing countries. And there will have to be more, Commissioner. What we have at the moment is not enough. The developed countries must show an example. They must be ambitious in reducing their emissions by at least 30%, and they must provide co-finance and technology to the developing countries. Mr. Ver.
You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Mr. Commissioner, the representative of the Council, colleagues, dear visitors, hello, people from Slovenia. Please allow me to highlight a simple fact. Copenhagen may not come at the right time. This is a crisis, and to have to reach such an important decision during a crisis is very unfortunate. But I would like to highlight that Copenhagen will be a successful story if we manage to keep the environmental and social aspects, if we manage to reach an agreement on CO2 reductions. The Council and the Commission need to finalize their amounts that have to be reached by 2020. We also have to ensure sustainable development. We have to ensure a social dimension. We have to enable financing for developing countries, especially. If we fail to do this, I think that this generation will have passed a historical chance. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Lukaszewska. 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Madam President. In the context of our debate, I have 2 contributions. As we make proposals to reduce CO2 emissions and give help to developing countries, we must not forget about the present situation in the economy. In other words, the economic and financial crisis. It's all very well to set ambitious objectives, but implementation is more important. We also need to raise awareness among the public of the need for climate change measures. People do regard climate change as a serious problem, but they believe that it is up to governments to solve the problem. Thus we need to appeal to people. We need information and awareness raising campaigns to encourage people to change their behavior, to change their household energy consumption. People need to be aware that lifestyle has an economic and environmental cost.
Mrs. Ticau.
Thank you, Madam President. Commissioner, development mechanism and the allotment of an important fund for developing countries are quite important for concluding an international agreement post-Kyoto. The best argument to persuade other countries to join a post-Kyoto agreement is given by the measures taken by the EU in order to comply with its commitments. We have to establish a fund for energy efficiency in each member state. We have to increase the finance for weathering buildings. By such measures, we can create 7 million jobs by 2020. We need new financing mechanisms for low-carbon industries. This will allow countries to produce in a green way. Thank you.
For 1 minute, Mr. Kelly.
Mr. Kelly, please.
Thank you, President.
by many speakers, and absolutely correctly so. Industrialised deforestation, individual deforestation. I myself mentioned and noticed that when I worked on a voluntary basis in Africa, day in, day out, I saw people climbing up the mountain, spending the whole day with a little axe, cutting down timber, coming down in the afternoon, carrying that little bundle of timber on their head or on a bicycle. It's quite obvious that this cannot be tackled without dealing with the whole question of global poverty, because individuals are not going to stop chopping down wood for the greater good of society if it means they themselves are going to starve. So climate change and global poverty will have to be tackled hand in hand. Thank you very much.
Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ. Και η κυρία Dodds, η τελευταία.
Thank you, Mrs. Dodds.
Κυρία Dodds. Mrs. Dodds?
Yes,
please.
Thank you, Madam President. There has been much talk in this chamber this morning about developing countries playing their part in tackling climate change. And that is indeed true, and like many others, I would draw attention to the fact that in order to do this in regions of great poverty, this House, the Council and the Commission will have to take cognizance of the cost involved, and there will have to be a strategy in order to tackle this. However, I would not like to leave this House without saying that in areas like my own in Northern Ireland, areas of high energy costs, there also needs to be some work done so that those who are disadvantaged, where there are high levels of fuel poverty among disadvantaged people, where we have an economic base that relies on small business, that these too need to be able to take account of the costs of tackling climate change.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. Τελευταίος παρεμβαίνουν.
Thank you very much. Now, positively, the final speaker, Mr. Tanner. 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you very much for allowing me to speak. I would like to express my support with the fundamental aims of our strategies. That is, to prevent the global climate to increase by more than 2 degrees centigrade. We need less greenhouse gases, less warming. I would like to warn about another component, though, the technological breakthroughs. I believe in technology. By only limiting things, we will not achieve our goals. We need greater investments in technological breakthroughs, especially in artificial CO2 reduction, and especially in the development of a fusion reactor. I would like to call on the Commission to put much more interest in these kinds of investments as well. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of the round of Catch the Eye. Now, Minister Carlgren on behalf of the Council.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to address all members of Parliament who made a contribution to the debate and thank them for this very far-sighted approach to the problem. There is broad political support in the European Parliament, and the Parliament plays a very strong and important role, leading positions in Europe in negotiations. I am happy to accept this resolution on climate from the Environment Committee. This commitment, which exists here in the European Parliament, will be very helpful for the remaining 48 days before Copenhagen. We shall make best use of the days remaining, and this means that we'll be going out into the external world to try to exert pressure on the other countries. A global threat can only be solved with a global response, and here it has been said that it's very important to have a global partnership. I agree with that. We need a global approach towards a carbon-poor future with efficient technology, and I agree, I believe this is very necessary as part of a global pact of solidarity. And now I'll be going to the Luxembourg Environment Council, and I would like to determine a mandate for the European Union for the Copenhagen Conference, referring to long-term objectives for the European Union to reduce emissions by more than 80% by the year 2050. We need to encourage the other countries to come along with us to strengthen their efforts at reduction so that we can all achieve our objective of a reduction of emissions by 30%. We also need a sustainable culture. The financing is important as well. And finally, we need a mandate including all the points which is adopted by Council.
Thank you. Now, Commissioner De Gucht.
Madam President.
Hvala, gospa predsedujoča. Čisto na kratko. Po tej razpravi in po posredovanju sveta, mislim, da lahko rečemo, da smo pripravljeni na konferencu v Kopenhavnu. Vidim, da naš v splošnem podpirate pri naših predlogih in tudi zaveze, finančne obveze, ki smo jih predlagali.
Also our common understanding that we have with the developing world, the commitments that we have been making towards them, and maybe foremost that we also have agreed on an internal redistribution of the efforts that have to be made by the European Union, because making commitments, making promises, but not having agreed among yourselves, that's of course not very effective in this kind of things. So we can go forward, provided of course that the European Council later this month gives support to these proposals. I have no doubt about that. Now we expect also the others to come forward, and then we speak about the United States, we speak also about the BRIC countries. They have to come forward. I think we need a frank and open discussion in Copenhagen. It will certainly not be easy, that's the least one can say, but I think we are really discussing there about our common future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That brings the debate to an end. There seems to be a common commitment, and so we can be optimistic about a common approach. The House stands adjourned until 12 o'clock for the votes.